People don't like talking about startup deaths. They whisper about them in hallways, bury them under polite phrases like pivoted, ran out of runway, or strategic shutdown, as if softening the words could soften the truth. But the truth doesn't care about your vocabulary. Startups don't just die. They collapse, they suffocate, they implode from wounds that everyone saw coming, but nobody had the courage or humility to address. I've watched startups die up close. Hell, I've watched one of mine die, and it wasn't poetic or educational in the moment. It was violent in the quietest way, like slowly drowning while pretending you're learning to swim. And the worst part? Sometimes the death starts long before you notice the body hitting the floor. Ours began with a lie, a tiny one, the kind founders tell themselves all the time. We're fine. We weren't. The signs were everywhere. Slowing user growth, mounting technical debt, a burn rate built on optimism instead of reality, and a culture slipping from hungry to fragile. But when you're in the middle of building something you love, denial feels easier than truth. We kept shipping features that nobody asked for because innovation, we told ourselves, was the only way to stay ahead. Except innovation without relevance is just noise wrapped in confidence. Our customers weren't leaving because competitors were better. They were leaving because we had stopped listening. But I didn't want to hear that. I was too busy trying to look like a leader instead of being one. Pride, I've learned, is the cancer that kills startups quietly. Then came the moment I should have recognized as the beginning of the end. Our biggest customer called and said they were evaluating alternatives. In startup language, that's the equivalent of someone in a relationship saying, "We need to talk." I still remember sitting in the conference room, heart pounding, pretending to smile as they listed every frustration we had ignored for months. We promised fixes. We promised timelines. We promised things we didn't have the capacity or discipline to deliver. They nodded politely, and a week later, they left. That single churn didn't kill us, but it cut one of the arteries we were relying on to keep the company breathing. Cash got tight. Tighter than I admitted. Tighter than even my closest teammates knew. I cut my salary to zero, then slashed budgets so aggressively that it felt like amputating limbs and hoping the body would keep walking. But desperate cuts don't save dying companies. They simply prolong the suffering. Then the team started slipping, not because they were bad, but because they were exhausted. You can only sprint for so long before your lungs give out. I began seeing the subtle signs. Missed deadlines, forced enthusiasm, people staying later, but accomplishing less. In one meeting, a senior engineer looked at me with hollow eyes and said, "We don't know what direction we're running anymore." That sentence haunted me for months. Leadership isn't about having all the answers, but it is about providing clarity. And mine had dissolved under the weight of fear of failure, fear of looking weak. Fear of admitting we were no longer in control of the ship we had built. Investors noticed too. Their emails shifted from supportive to urgent to "let's schedule a discussion about your future roadmap." Investor language is diplomatic. The message was not. What they were really saying was, "Convince us you aren't about to die." The problem was, I couldn't. Our metrics were decaying. Our team was burning out. Our runway was evaporating faster than our excuses. Worst of all, our mission, the thing that once felt like fire in our chests, had become a burden none of us could articulate without feeling like hypocrites. But I kept pushing. That's the thing about founders. We mistake stubbornness for resilience. We pretend grit means refusing to quit, when sometimes grit actually means having the courage to face the truth. I didn't. I dragged the team through another quarter of forced optimism, trying one desperate tactic after another: price cuts, feature bundles, partnerships that looked promising only in slide decks. Everything we touched felt heavy, slow, off-key. When a startup loses its rhythm, it doesn't stumble, it sinks. The final blow came on a Tuesday morning. I remember the sunlight hitting my desk at the exact wrong angle, making everything feel too bright, too real. Our bank account wasn't just low, it was empty in slow motion. Payroll was 5 days away. I had no magic left, no investor checks to save the day, No secret plan hidden up my sleeve. I gathered the team. Some of them already knew. Some of them still believed I had one last miracle. But miracles, I've learned, don't visit founders who ignore reality. I told them the truth. We were shutting down. The silence in the room wasn't anger. It was grief. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits heavy on the chest and makes it hard to swallow. One person started crying quietly. Another stared at the floor as if answers were hidden in the tiles. A third walked out, not because they were upset, but because the pain was too much to hold in a room full of witnesses. After the meeting, I sat alone at my desk, surrounded by the ghosts of decisions I wished I'd made sooner. And for the first time since starting the company, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of failure. Not the tidy, motivational failure people write about in articles, but the raw kind that scrapes pieces of your identity away. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Startups don't just die because of bad luck or competition or lack of funding. They die because somewhere along the way, the founder loses sight of the truth. And truth is oxygen. Without it, everything suffocates. In the weeks that followed, I replayed every turning point. Every red flag, every ignored warning, and slowly, painfully, a pattern emerged. The mistakes that kill startups always start small. A skipped user interview, a delayed refactor, a vague strategy, a tolerance for good enough, a culture that stops questioning, a leader who stops listening. Failure doesn't appear suddenly. It accumulates, layer by layer, until the structure gives way. But buried inside that collapse was something I didn't expect: clarity. When you strip away illusion, pride, momentum, and panic, what remains is something brutally honest, something you can build from again. And that's the real gift of failure. It forces you back to the truth about who you are, the truth about why you build, the truth about what matters when everything else is gone. And it was in that truth, raw and humiliating, that I finally understood that the death of one startup isn't the end of you, it's the end of who you were. What rises from that ending is different, wiser, harder, more dangerous, in the best possible way. Because once you've watched a dream collapse in your hands, you either break or you become someone unbreakable. And as I stood in that empty office on the final day, staring at the outline of desks that had already been removed, I realized that sometimes a startup has to die not to teach you how to win, but to teach you what winning actually requires. And in that moment, as I took one last breath inside the space where our dream had lived, I understood that the next company I built would be shaped by every scar, every regret, every truth learned from watching something I loved fall apart. Because the real lesson in failure is not how to avoid death, but how to rise after it, when suddenly the door behind me clicked shut, and I knew the next step I took would determine whether the failure I had just lived through would become the weight that dragged me under, or the foundation I would stand on for the rest of my life. As I walked away from that office, a hollow building now filled only with echoes, I felt the strange mixture of grief and clarity settle into my bones. People assume that when a startup dies, the founder's world collapses instantly. But the truth is quieter. It unravels thread by thread, and by the time the final thread snaps, you're too numb to scream. That numbness followed me for weeks. Every morning I woke up reaching for tasks that no longer existed. My identity had been so tightly intertwined with the company that without it, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Friends told me to take time off, but rest is a luxury the wounded can't afford. My mind replayed every mistake on loop, dissecting decisions with a precision that felt like self-inflicted surgery. But somewhere in that painful introspection, a shift began. Failure, when you sit with it long enough, stops shouting and starts whispering. And in those whispers, I began to uncover truths I had spent years ignoring. The first truth: we didn't fail because we weren't capable. We failed because we stopped being honest. Honest with users, honest with the market, honest with ourselves. The second truth: momentum had replaced mission. We chased growth metrics instead of genuine value. We celebrated vanity milestones while the core cracked quietly underneath. And the third truth, the one that cut the deepest, I had become the bottleneck. My fear of appearing uncertain kept me from seeking help when I needed it most. My need to look strong kept my team in the dark. Leadership built on performance instead of vulnerability always collapses under pressure. Accepting these truths didn't heal me, but it anchored me, because once you understand why something died, you can finally begin to understand how to build something that lives. But before any rebuilding could happen, I had to confront the thing founders avoid more than failure itself: identity without a company. I remember the first networking event I attended after the shutdown. Someone asked me, "So, what do you do?" And for the first time in a decade, I didn't have an answer polished and ready. I opened my mouth, but the words caught in my throat. I wasn't a CEO anymore. I wasn't a founder with traction, or revenue, or a team. I was just a person standing in a crowded room, stripped of the armor I had worn for years. It was humiliating, but also liberating, because once the identity you clung to burns down, the only thing left is truth. And truth is fertile soil. In that fragile phase, something unexpected began to happen. People started reaching out, not to judge, but to share their own failures. Founders I had admired from afar confessed stories of near collapse, secret pivots, internal betrayals, and nights spent crying in parking lots. Investors admitted they had backed companies that imploded far more spectacularly than mine. It dawned on me that failure isn't the exception in this world, it's the price of admission. The only difference is that some people hide it and others transform it. I decided to transform mine. I began advising early-stage founders, not because I felt wise, but because I knew what mistakes smelled like long before they became visible. I could see denial in their eyes, overconfidence in their projections, fragility in their culture. And strangely, helping them navigate their storms helped me rise from my own wreckage. One founder asked me, "What's the biggest lesson from your failure?" I didn't hesitate. A startup doesn't die when it runs out of money. It dies when the founder runs out of honesty. Saying it aloud felt like cracking open a vault I had kept locked even from myself. Over time, clarity evolved into conviction. The insights carved from my scars weren't just painful, they were powerful. And that power sparked something I didn't expect: the desire to build again. But this time, I refused to build from ego or desperation. I would build from truth. The new idea didn't arrive as a lightning strike. It came quietly, like a seed carried by the wind, landing in soil I didn't realize was ready. At first, I dismissed it. Fear still lived in my bones, and fear is persuasive. It tells you stories about what happened last time. But the idea kept returning, persistent, patient, as if whispering, "You're not done." And maybe I wasn't. So I approached the new company differently. No bravado, no inflated projections, no chasing vanity metrics. I spoke to users first, not to impress them, but to understand them. I built the smallest version I could, stripped of ego and ornament. I recruited a team not because they were brilliant on paper, but because they were grounded, honest, and hungry to solve a real problem. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, momentum began to form again. But this time, momentum didn't blind me. I embraced transparency. When things broke, I admitted it. When strategy shifted, I said why. When I didn't know the answer, I said so loud enough for the room to hear. And something remarkable happened. The team didn't lose confidence. They gained trust. Trust became our currency. Honesty became our engine. Humility became our compass. And the company grew not faster, not louder, but steadier, stronger, more resilient than anything I had built before. The old scars were still there, but now they served as warnings, guardrails, reminders of roads I would never walk again. The death of my first startup had not been the end of my story. It had been the shaping of the version of me capable of writing the next chapter. And if there is one final truth I wish every founder could carve onto their heart, it is this: failure is not the opposite of success. It is the architect of it. Your startup may die. Your idea may collapse. Your plans may burn to ash. But if you are willing to sit with the truth hidden inside that rubble, you will rise with a clarity the earlier version of you never had. And rising with that clarity makes you unstoppable. If this story reached a part of you, you don't talk about the part that fears failure, that hides its wounds, that wonders whether you'll survive the blows, then tell me in the comments what it stirred inside you. And if you want more of these raw, unfiltered lessons from the trenches, hit follow and stay close, because none of us build alone, and your next chapter is waiting.